Keki, and we thought we were doing the sotto voce, but I think you've all heard the deliberations. We were just trying to figure whether we should start with poetry, because we're expecting more people to come in shortly. But on the other hand, reading poetry is a very significant part of any session, so maybe we should keep that for later. What do you think? It's waffle. So let me start. He's suggesting waffling. I'm going to chat about you.
Chat about each other.
Actually, what has happened in the earlier session was to be wound up just 2 minutes before.
Okay.
It was wound up much earlier.
Yes.
So there was a big gap of 15 minutes.
Yes.
Maybe the result people walked out, but we expect after the action that...
No problem. They will walk in. Actually, I will rewind to the time I first discovered Keki's poetry, which happened when I was in college in the 1980s. I was in the St. Xavier's College Library, and I remember uncovering Keki Daruwalla, poets with names like Keki Daruwalla and Arun Kolatkar and Eunice D'Souza and Arvind Krishna Mehrotra. And it was to me a revelation that one could be a living poet. It really felt like that was a contradiction in terms, but in a very small, subtle way, it also held out promise. It also felt like, oh my God, this is possible. It's possible to be a poet, to be alive, and to take the form seriously. Later, I began reading Daruwalla's poetry, and I think the qualities that have always struck me about his poetry are perhaps 3 things that I'd like to mention, Keki. The first thing that struck me was his feel for image, and yet it is a feel for image that never turns sweet, it never turns decorative, it never turns effete. There's a kind of vigor in a Keki Daruwalla poem. A Keki Daruwalla poem is always energetic. That's the quality of the imagery. It moves, it's dynamic, it's powerful. And the second quality that struck me was this fascination with historical moments, often seen from a bird's eye view. And I use the word bird's eye view very deliberately because there are in fact many birds in these poems. The hawk has been a recurrent presence, and you have a sense of this hawk looking down on the march of civilizations, on the unfolding of history, and the birds are still very much there in the collected poems. What has changed, and which I point out in my introduction to his collected poems, is that there is a difference in these birds now. Earlier, the hawk, you found the hawk looking down from a precipice of light. That's a phrase from his poem. Today, you also have a crane with its eyes closed in winged meditation. You also have a snow eagle, sedate as a llama. You find the birds doing different things now. And it feels like there is a greater preoccupation with cycles. Time is more circular now. The earth recurs. Subterranean spaces, darker spaces. More nocturnality, more earth, and at the same time, this tension between earth and sky, which I find particularly striking in his collected poems. So there is in Keki's poetry this expansiveness as well as an exactitude. And for me, that tension is what I look for and what excites me about his work. Since people have started coming in, I can stop waffling, but this was for me pleasurable waffling because it gave me time to actually, thank you, it gave me time to actually talk about the things that I've enjoyed about your work and written about. I hope you could hear me, Keki. Okay. So I wanted to start by asking you, I remember you once told me that up to the age of 25, you wanted to be a cricketer. Start there. Were you a bowler? Were you a batsman? And where the hell was poetry?
Both. I was both a outswing bowler and a middle order batsman. But I got into service at the age of 20. And once you got into the police, there was no escape hatch to become a sportsman. And I took my duties rather too seriously. But before that, I must thank you for the lovely introduction. I must also thank the Goa International Center for asking me over. This is my 4th time in 10 years, so I am a regular veteran of the Goa festival. We are talking about literary lives, isn't it? As far as I'm concerned, I never stepped out into the rural area till I got into service. You stayed in small towns. A small town means a hang-up, a slight complex that you are from a small town. I mean, when we used to come to Lucknow, I used to straight away go to a bookshop, get a book by George Barker, with whom I read later on, and Louis MacNeice, Auden, thin, lovely books, and very, very cheap, very cheap. So, and the complex is always there till you come to a big city. For instance, when I talk about my novel, and there is M.N. Roy in the novel, the last one that I have, I hadn't heard of M.N. Roy till I got a call in the morning. It was my first posting as ESP Dehradun. And the policeman on the other side said, "Sir, the Ellen Roy has been murdered." I hadn't heard of M.N. Roy till then. So in a way, I'm making amends by talking about him in my novel at the moment. So, when I look back at myself, I look back at a chap who comes from a small town. And that hangover of being a small town man never disappears, you know. And, well, I had a father who was very extrovert. Cambridge, Oxford, played billiards, all England. Bharti Nari, though she was a class fellow of Justice Chagla in Bombay, but always sort of. So I used to tell my wife that I have two aspects. Either I'm, throwing my chest out or withdrawing myself because of my mother's genes. And I look back on a life where much of it has been spent in self-effacement. You put a shadow on your work and you sort of withdraw. I have been thinking over the last year or two that I should have once at least ventured out to Delhi and met Octavio Paz. I used to be posted in Meerut, Agra, very close to Delhi. You sit in a train and in 3 hours you'll be there, or 2 hours you'll be there. But I never summoned up the courage to go up to an Octavio Paz or anyone. And when I was in Struga with Mahmoud Darwish and earlier with Ritsos, Yanis Ritsos, I never went up to him and said, well, I am so-and-so and so-and-so. That's it.
At the same time, I mean, this is an interesting, what you're saying now is particularly interesting, Keki, and I hope we're recording this, are we? We are. Because this, what you talk about now in terms of a certain, what you think you inherited from your mother and what you inherited from your father, and the way in which you see yourself, in a way, between these two seemingly oppositional impulses, that's very interesting. I remember you telling me that you sent your poems to Nissim.
Yes.
And that Nissim wrote back this very courteous on an inland letter cover. Nissim wrote back a very courteous letter. I was stunned that Keki even called it courteous, but apparently it was, because that was also Nissim. He said, and one of the things you told me was that Nissim said, the poems, there's not much in these poems. Something that sounded damning to me.
No.
Huh?
It was shorter than that. I was in Joshimath when 1962 was I get depressed sometimes, and 62 was an entire year of depression as we were being beaten up, and there were parts of the army which ran, and there were desertions, and we had a lieutenant from Meerut, Lieutenant Goswami, who lost a leg, and he was given this. And when I was with the Prime Minister, I tried to help him with a gas agency, but they wouldn't give him a gas agency. He had one leg, and he had a gallantry medal. He had fought the Chinese, but anyway, that's bureaucracy. We won't get into it. What was I saying? Yes.
The letter.
So going to Joshimath, you had to walk a part of the way. It was so bad. 1963, October, Joshimath, I had a tin shed and I occupied it and stayed there. And letter to Bombay would mean 15 days. You know, it would go by dark, it would reach Srinagar. Srinagar meaning the Garhwal Srinagar, not the unhappy Srinagar today, the one we know about. And I wrote a letter to Nissim and sent him some poems, and he sent back a very courteous reply, and he said, he talked about the poetry scene a little, and he said, as far as your poems are concerned, I have nothing much to say. And then 2 years later, when I went to Bombay, this is after I already got married, and I showed him my poems, he was so happy with them, he wanted to publish a book by me. And there are compensatory things. Someone sent a fairly lousy magazine with a poem by me called Apparition in April. I still don't know what I meant by that poem. And Robert Graves saw it, and he wrote a letter to me. So my correspondence with Robert Graves was initiated by him and not by me. And it was a rave letter, but it didn't boost me up at all, because my poetry was fairly, I could see, I was always a critic of my own work, and I thought it was fairly lousy, if I may say so.
This correspondence with Robert Graves is something that not many people know about. So would you tell us something about that? Because it went back and forth for a while.
There's nothing much. I didn't even keep my letters. Some of them are there. To Davinder Kohli, for instance, because he is very fond of Robert Graves. And Bruce King wrote a book on Robert Graves, where I showed him my letters, and he has mentioned them in a very fine book on Robert Graves. And there again, it never even occurred to me to go to Mallorca, where he was there. Secondly, one never had the money to go abroad. Those were bad days, and you were paid as a SP 740 rupees. So the salaries were pretty bad. And I must tell you this story. When I took over my first posting in the police as ASP Dehradun, I sat on my chair, and the first question I asked the Peshi meant a head constable and a constable writer. And I asked, what is the salary of a constable? And they sort of conspired with each other, and on a slip of paper they wrote 30 -1 -50. I knew that constable's salary ended at 50. This much I knew, and the head constable started at 60. So I said, ये बीच में एक क्या है? उसने कहा साहब ₹1 का इंक्रीमेंट मिलता है हर साल.
I'm wondering, Keki, whether this distance that you're talking about, geographical distance, from Bombay, which was seen in some sense with Nissim there as a hub of the literary scene, particularly the poetry scene. And you talk about your life in all these places, Joshimath and Barabanki, Agra, all these are places you've been in. Do you feel that your distance, geographical, also professional in a way, you had a whole alternative professional life going on, was that distance actually an advantage when you look back in retrospect?
I don't know. I mean, if I had to live my life again, I would rather do a master's in philosophy today. Not possibly in literature. But
yeah, I would too.
There it was. I never attended a poetry reading till 1965 or 66. I never talked to a poet. The very fine Kuvanaran was very much in Lucknow, but I never either had the time or had plucked the energy to go across and meet him, you know. So I kept away from. The first poet I met was Kersi Katrak in Ranikhet when they came to Sham Benegal, and Kersi Katrak came to have 2 months in Ranikhet, and that's where I met the first Indian English poet, or any poet for that matter, in a lifetime.
What I'm asking, I guess, is also whether your perception of the scene at that time, did it seem like a place of ferment, an invitational space, or did it seem like a cartel, a coterie? How did this Bombay literary scene appear to you? Did this seem like were these the gatekeepers of a poetic tradition? Did you feel that was the
Bombay 2 years later? All that my first visit dealing with poets was that I bought Summer in Calcutta by Kamla Das, 5 rupees, a beautiful cover, and very fine poetry, as you would know. And I met Nissim in where Sham Benegal's wife, Neera Benegal, was also on the staff.
Yes.
So that was my first, and I took a few books. One was a book on dreams, and 2 or 3 books I took from them. And I could never review. Reviewing was something impossible for me. And one just tried, because the first book which came before me, I couldn't review. So you had sort of a obstacle course, and you slowly went over it.
I'm going to ask you about your poetry specifically and the ways in which you think it has changed. But before that, since we are on the subject of, you mentioned Nissim, you mentioned Kersi Katrak, I'm going to just pause a moment here, because anecdotes about a literary world of a particular moment can be of great interest to many of us decades later. It may feel like gossip at the time that they're happening, but much later it becomes literary history. So I'm curious about some of the interactions you were having with poets when you started, after you met Kersi Katrak, after you met Nissim. I remember you once mentioned that Arun Kolatkar was someone whose work you solicited for an anthology, and he never quite delivered. But then he turned up for your reading and then offered you the work and vanished before you started the reading. Tell us more.
There's nothing to tell. When 1980 or 1979, I was in Kashmir, additional commissioner, and I thought I was a history behind it. Sheikh Abdullah wanted me, and my organization wouldn't send me, and then they posted me there. So, and with Sheikh Abdullah as the chief minister. Anyway, I don't want to talk about it at that moment. I wrote to the poets, and it was all handwritten letters, there was nothing else. And everyone replied, except Arun. Possibly he was too busy with his advertising or this or that. Then Nissim offered me, I had 2 or 3 readings by then. The first reading was with Kersi as chairman. And he introduced me as, this is Keki Daruwalla from Lucknow. Go ahead, read. That was it. What was I saying? Sorry.
Yes. No, never mind. Continue. This is the sort of anecdote we want. Yeah.
So, and Nissim was there, and I still remember at a reading, Dastur Bode was there. Dastur Bode was a big priest and a very controversial priest amongst the Parsis. And Nissim, even as he saw him, and I also saw him, he said, you be wary. And any question which Dastur Bode asked me, Nissim would intervene and he would answer from my side. And the first question Dastur Bode asked was, there's nothing about the Parsis in the book. So,
and
such kinds of things happen.
Yes, and Arun came for this particular reading.
Arun came to this at this 49, whatever it is, Marine Lines.
Yes, the PEN.
And he said, he wrote to me, he wrote 2 lines, the fact that I never answered your letters was inexcusable, and please feel free to use whatever poems you'll want. And his wife was also there. And he said, I have another commitment, and he went off. After that, I never met him, never saw him.
Keki, since your first book, in fact, I should say here, I realized that Keki's first book was published in 1970. So it's going to be 50 years next year since Under Orion.
Shows my age.
So it is quite incredible to think back on a career of 5 decades. And I'm going to ask you how you think your work, when you look back on Under Orion and you look now at your collected poems, what are the threads that you feel have stayed constant? What has changed and how? Tell us something about how you look at your work.
Without contemplating, I mean, one is, if I may say so, waffling. You see, the other elements that you have grown up with, because my father was a professor and he had about 3,000 books in the house. And I was steeped in literature, and I am a product of English literature, not American literature, not Australian literature, not Indian language literature. I have to be very frank. It was English literature, coming down from, I didn't study Chaucer, but the Elizabethans we studied really well, the dramatists, and Milton, the shorter poems, not the Paradise Lost. Criticism on Milton, yes, after T.S. Eliot and all got after him, arteriosclerosis of the oral imagination. All that we dealt with.
Yes.
And we never had T.S. Eliot or any poet beyond that in our syllabi. And the syllabus of Punjab University used to be very, very odd. My father used to be absolutely astounded. There was a 100 marks paper on John Galsworthy. And we had all the plays of Galsworthy. Thank God for my father's library. So, and one book of criticism. Then Manmohan Singh and I, we pulled up the money and
Which
another
Manmohan
book by
Singh?
a Takahashi.
Which Manmohan Singh?
Sorry?
What Manmohan Singh?
No, not the Prime Minister. A classmate of mine. He got into the IAS later. And we pulled in the money and we got a book from Japan. A book of criticism on Galsworthy. Sorry, I drifted apart. I didn't answer
No,
your
you are in
question.
fact beginning to answer it, which is how you feel your poetry has actually been changed over the years and what has stayed the same. So you started by saying that the English poets were a particularly significant part of your life, early life, reading life.
Much of my initial poetry, I could never, waste a thought on how I write. So it was unconscious. And I now look back and I feel that I confronted reality sometimes upfront and sometimes in an elliptic way. The slanting. You know, you hit reality at a slant.
Yes.
So that's how I confronted reality. And the first two books, unfortunately, if I may say so, were the product of P. Lal asking me for a book. So I said, why not? So I started. It was in Barabanki, of all places. And I struggled. I didn't struggle. Anything I saw, I mean, for example, my wife and I were having a walk. A lady from a cycle rickshaw had an epileptic fit and she fell down. And I saw the whole thing. And I wrote a poem on the epileptic and it was anthologized 20 years or 30 years later in Canada and USA and all the rest. And I told an audience in USA that you people look for a poem, a subject like famine or epilepsy from an Indian. And you include it in your anthology. And they laughed in a very embarrassed way, but I told them straight. So, and myth used to attract me, but I'm not a believer. I am just not a believer. So, bad for me, especially talking to a spiritualist, you know.
I'm not a believer either, I should point out. Not a believer at all.
So, the myths came in and I didn't believe in the myths. And I started chipping away at the myths and have done so through all these years. Whether it's with Christ in the manger or with any other Hindu myth, I've been at it. Then history,
Yes.
because my father was very fond of history, and we were brought up with all those stories about history. You know, Shivaji cutting off the fingers of Shaista Khan as he jumped from the, and he escaped. He was the uncle of Aurangzeb. I'm just telling you one story. I'm sorry we are taking too much time over.
No, we are digressing, but often the most interesting things in conversations, I've realized, happen in parentheses. Yes, please continue.
Yes. So the myth came in, history came in, and you again turned something into something different.
Do you
Well,
feel,
you were
though...
writing a poem on it.
Yes.
If you were including that in a short story or a story, it would be totally different.
When you say you came to things slant, do you feel that that has changed? Do you feel you're less?
No. Now I'm attacking whatever the government is doing upfront, absolutely. But those are political articles. They are not short
poetry.
stories. They are not creative literature. I mean, you have to separate a political article or a semi-political article with what you do with fiction or
Yes.
poetry.
I see that. I know that your short fiction, Keki, was published quite a while ago in the Illustrated Weekly. Am I right?
Yes.
And I remember Keki saying that there's nothing like being published in the Illustrated Weekly of India to turn you into a pan-Indian figure in a jiffy. And so once you've been published, then after that you have to continue writing short fiction because you've become a fiction writer. Tell us about that foray, those forays, early forays into short fiction.
Well, I'll tell you a small thing. Poor Martin Luther died, and it struck me. I wrote a poem, and I was absolutely certain that this is going to be published. There's no question of the Illustrated Weekly not publishing it, and I sent it off, and it was published. Within 15 days, I got the Illustrated Weekly, and there it was, and I started writing for them. And but earlier, during a posting in Agra, I found that Khushwant Singh was coming. The circuit house list would be given to the SP. The SSB had gone on, they used to go to Nainital in summer. And so I was in charge of the district. I went and met him. He said, "Oh, your father taught me. I've been a student of your father." I said, "Okay." And then he said, "What do you write?" I said, "What makes you think I write?" He says, "You wouldn't have come to meet me if you had." But he never forgot it. And he held it against me. He thought I was in intelligence or something, and I was snooping on him. It wasn't, the wretched list came, and I went and met him, and then he says, "Send me some poems," and there is nothing of the Indian landscape in poetry. I said, "Of course I'll send you some poems." I took my poems, and he offered me a drink, and he was very happy with them, and then he asked me, "Can I place them in some magazine?" I said, "Why not?" And he placed my first 2 or 3 poems in Quest in January 1964. I remember it. Sorry, I didn't answer your
I was
question.
asking about your short fiction, but it's just as well that you didn't answer it, because I feel before we start talking about your fiction, Keki, I think we should have you read some poems.
What should I read?
I would ideally like some early poems, but you don't have them with you.
These days, shall I go up there and...
Why not? Yeah.
I always start. Prayer on January 30 and 82, two of us read it in Delhi on 30th January 2002. Rukmini Bhai Nair and I, and well, okay. I'll cut out the first stanza and read the poem. Prayer on January 30, and actually it's not a prayer only on Gandhi, it's a prayer on future and for the country. Let not the harsh winds of our times blow love away. Let not the harsh winds of our times blow our perceptions into a wall behind which people are sharpening knives. Let not the harsh dreams of our times devour us along with our appetites. Lead us from this landscape of rubble to water, but let the sound be real. Even traffic sounds like surf at night. and let water remain water and not turn to blood. Lead us from chemical colors to vegetable dyes. I'll read that again. Lead us from chemical colors to vegetable dyes, from plastic to cotton, from fractions to wholeness. Ephemeral as we are, let the infinite touch us somewhere. Detach us from the tree of time, and those with no faith, cast them on the waters of belief, guys like me. Let hidden move into knowledge. Let there be harmony between those who speak of shadows and those who speak of the sun. Let the unlit be lit. Steer the light our way. Let the forest leaf. Let the lyric leaf. And it was in 2 days, everything was negative. We had Godra. But this doesn't always happen. I am a little pessimistic. I wrote a poem on, well, I have a whole book on Cyrus and all the rest. And I talked about the death of Cyrus. And then I went out for dinner and then came back at 11 and fed the poem. And by 12 o'clock, I got a call from the control room that Rajiv Gandhi has been assassinated. These things happen in, in life, you know. Okay. Yes, I'll read that. Can I read 2 poems more? Okay. One is, I've just chanced upon it, Birds and Trees in Iraq. I was asked to write on birds and trees in Iraq, and I have read that often. I'm sorry. Some of you may have heard it before. No matter how the desert shuffles between the 2 waters, no matter how the blood flows in Mesopotamia now, or how the young die with bomb belts around their waists, so that the streets itself turn into grape shot. No matter how many sandbags enclose nervous machine guns, no matter how the fire engine clangs and the ambulance screams, dates will sprout and cluster around palm trees, and the kingfisher dressed in lapis lazuli will float and flutter over the Tigris, and his warped image will struggle and shiver in the water. And I'll read a... Sorry. Should have... What is letter 39, okay. I never read it, but why shouldn't I? Letter. During these empty seasons, it is passé to survive. Hence this letter out of nowhere to you, as if you were alive. There are dreams to decipher at dawn before you throw them in the bin. The round of unlatching windows to let the cool air in. Plucking a blade of lemongrass, clean the gas burner, kindle a fire ring to put the kettle on boil. Sniffing hard to find if there's some fragrance left in the grass planted a year back in our yard. Newsprint comes in handy, and tea, rustle of headlines, meaningless tomorrow. The bustle of things going awry except the spin and orbit of astral spheres. Pigeons explode next, troubled by a noise that hasn't reached my ears. They circle round wall and ledge and settle back to shuffle on the wire or leave birdlime on the ledge. Poetry. As one gets on in age, I write around the same dream on the same page. Paper gets larger, dream shorter. Our daughter tore a knee ligament while skiing. Happens, I presume. It's been surgically repaired. Am not certain by whom. As for news and notable events, I'm not sure if there is much. The day goes by, sold the old jalopy. Some years back, we haven't kept in touch. And sorry, one more, if I may. She starts chasing him, and there are people who are watching, in the play. I don't know why she chases him, but the next one is a Maratha, and he's a Maratha, and he also wants the same woman. And again, this lady comes in, and she, the Rohilla, she attacks runs with a stick after the Rohilla, saying, "You are important." And this one is the homosexual. And the next one, the Maratha, she chases the Maratha, saying, "Oh, you are impotent,
I do not remember this play. I do not remember this play.
I'd just like to ask.
Yes.
Then she becomes famous, and then the Mughal emperor sends his emissary to him. But there is much more to the play. But I have told you the basic.
I do not remember this.
Anyone wanting to publish it, I say, I'm willing to give it without any royalty.
There's a late night Keki Daruwalla who does Urdu Shairi. Has there been any influence on your poetry on the Urdu Shairi that you love so much?
नहीं साहब कुछ नहीं उर्दू शायरी I don't want to pose as a I've never been an imposter but I've translated Faiz etc. You want to hear a translation? Do you
We would love to. Would you like? You have a choice. Do you want to read a translation? Or you want to read one of your own poems?
नहीं
Both.
Translation तो फिर
Okay, do the translation
वैसे
later. If
I think we have to
yeah,
More about novel.
you want to know more about the novel, please. What would you like to know?
I don't need mind. Why do you feel like going for fiction now after writing poetry for so long?
fiction.
Yeah.
But I have been
Novels.
living with fiction for a long time, short stories.
No, I'm
and
talking about particularly the long fiction, voluminous fiction, a novel.
Why the novel specifically?
Again, it's a challenge. And the second novel is about Junagadh, where I lived as a child, and I remember all those things. I mean, when the Indian Army was coming in, Shakir Muhammad, let's say the ADC of the Nawab, actually of the heir apparent, Walihad, comes to our house and he says, "We have guns of Mahmud Ghazni's time and we can bomb Rajkot with it." And he said, "I have a gun of those times. Then if I shoot Shamal Das Gandhi," Shamal Das was the nephew of Mahatma Gandhi. If you remember, there's a street, the Princess Street in Bombay has been named as Shamal Das Gandhi Street. And he said, Shamal Das Gandhi will look back and say, there go my intestines. I still remember what he said, and all that is in the novel. And then I had bought KP Menon's book. It used to cost, I bought a 700-page book for 7 rupees. Can you believe it? This is about 40 years ago. And everything I knew about Junagadh was right there.
I think this is a conversation to continue more informally outside, but Keki's work is available. You can always buy it and get him to autograph it. The author is available. Thank you so much. Thank you, Keki.